I'm the Group Program Manager for the Visual Studio Web Tools team. We'll be spending the next hour or so taking a look at some of the new tools that we've built both in our Visual Studio product as well as ASP.NET to enable you to build really rich experiences on the web using standards such as AJAX. I'm going to be covering four big areas in my session. The first one is what we call multi-targeting. Multi-targeting is the capability in Visual Studio to target different versions of the .NET framework. You can target the .NET 2.0 framework, the .NET 3.0 framework, and the .NET 3.5 framework, all from within the Visual Studio Orcas IDE. The real benefit of multi-targeting is having one tool set and continuing to be able to develop on your existing applications while also being able to take advantage of the new features that we have in .NET 3.5. The second area that I'm going to focus on is some of the great support that we're adding in the Visual Studio product for designing applications using CSS. We have a brand new visual designer that's focused on web standards. It gives you great tools for generating CSS as well as doing layout using CSS. The same design surface that we're incorporating into Visual Studio Orcas is also going into the Expression web product. So you also get that great designer-developer workflow if you have designers working on the same application as well as developers using Visual Studio. I'll also be talking about some of the things we're doing both in Visual Studio and in ASP.NET to make it a lot easier and a lot cleaner to incorporate data into your web applications. We've got a set of new controls in ASP.NET 3.5. Specifically, there's a list view control that gives you a lot more control over the output that's being generated by the server. As well, we have a new OR designer in Visual Studio that allows you to map database tables into objects and then use LINQ to manipulate that data before rendering it down to the browser. And then finally, as everyone knows, ASP.NET has done a ton of work to enable AJAX capabilities. We'll be looking at what ASP.NET is doing in terms of the new controls that they're adding in Orcas to enable AJAX functionality. And we'll be spending quite a bit of time in Visual Studio looking at the great new features that we've added for JavaScript so that if you're doing a lot of JavaScript development today, you'll really love what you're going to see inside of Visual Studio and the things we've done inside of Orcas. So with that, I'm going to conclude the obligatory part of my session, which are the slides, and we'll move straight into the demo because I think that's what everyone wants to see. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up Visual Studio Orcas. Everyone at the conference here should have gotten a CD or a DVD labeled Visual Studio Orcas Beta 1. Everything I'm going to be showing here, you should be able to go ahead and install that DVD on your machines and play with the same tools and give us feedback about what you like and what changes you'd like to see after using the beta. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the multi-targeting feature. What you'll notice is in the new website dialog, there's a new control up here that actually lets you pick which framework you want to target with the application or the project that you're creating. You can see that with .NET 3.5, there's a certain set of templates that I get over here. And if I go ahead and switch over to .NET 2.0, you'll notice that the WCF template went away. That's because Windows Communication Foundation is a thing that's available only in .NET 3.0 and above. So the templates that aren't relevant for .NET 2.0 aren't shown in this dialog. So let's just go ahead and create a simple website here. And we'll call it 2.0 website. And what you'll see is it basically creates the same thing that you're used to seeing in Visual Studio 2005 today. If I go ahead and look at my web.config file, you can see that we really haven't added anything. And when I go ahead and run this application, it's going to run and compile under the .NET 2.0 framework. Now, if we go back and create another application, let's just go ahead and do the same thing. And let's go switch over to .NET 3.5. You'll notice that WCF service comes back. And we can just go ahead and create the same kind of website in .NET 3.5. So we'll call this one 3.0 website. And we'll go ahead and create that. And initially, you'll kind of get the same experience. You're going to see the same kind of project items that have been created. But if we look a little bit deeper, let's go look at the web.config. You can see that Visual Studio has actually done a lot of work to configure your application to run under the .NET 3.5 framework. If I go ahead and bring up the properties for this application, You can see that we've added some references that refer to assemblies that are available in .NET 3.5. For instance, there's system.core, which gives you functionality around link. As well, there's a reference to system.web.extensions, which is all the ASP.NET AJAX tooling that comes along with .NET 3.5. The other thing you'll notice is that inside the web.config file, I can actually see that we're adding default references for those things. We've also added a tag prefix so that all the new controls that come in ASP.NET 3.5 continue to get the ASP colon prefix when you're programming against them inside of your markup. As well, if you scroll further down, you'll see that we've actually referenced a different set of compilers. Not in the right place. Oh, here we go. And we've actually referenced a different set of compilers inside the web.config file. You'll see that instead of compiling with the 2.0 compilers for VB and C#, ASP.NET now uses the 3.5 compilers, both for VB and C#. And this is important if you're doing things like link, where the compiler will understand the link syntax if it's referencing 3.5. If you're compiling with 2.0, it's not going to understand the new syntax that's introduced. So that's one thing that we've done with multi-targeting. A couple of the other things that you'll see here is, as I go ahead and do add new item, you'll see that we've actually enabled a few new items. There's items that relate to having web forms that are pre-configured for AJAX. So we have an AJAX web form. We have an AJAX master page. We also have an item for WCF service if you want to incorporate that into your application. And again, we have some JavaScript files that refer to AJAX. So we're also smart about understanding that you're targeting .NET 3.5 and showing the right things in the add item dialog. Additionally, if I go to the toolbox, you'll see in the toolbox here, there's a few new controls. There's a list view control, which I'll be showing later on. As well, there's a link data source control. And you can see that all the new controls that we have with ASP.NET AJAX also show up in the toolbox. So multi-targeting really enables the IDE to dynamically show you the things that are available in the framework that you're targeting. Now let's say we can actually go ahead and modify the application, the framework that I want to target. And I'm actually downgrading here, so I'm going from 3.5 to 2.0. The more likely example would be that you start off with 2.0 and you'd switch it to 3.5. But I just want to do that to show you the contrast in kind of what happens when you change an application from one version of the framework to the other. So we'll go ahead and move that to 2.0. And now when we go ahead and take a look at web.config, you can see that all that extra syntax that we had to kind of reference the things that were in 3.5 is gone. So I'm going back to the plain vanilla 2.0 framework. And as well, if I go to add new item, I'll see that all the AJAX items that were there before are now filtered out, so I'm only seeing the things that were in 2.0. So if you're building an application today and you want to continue to develop it, but want to take advantage of all the new tools that Orcas has, you can go ahead and move up to Orcas, but still continue to target the same framework that you're targeting today. And just finally, we can go ahead and take a look at the toolbox as well. You'll notice that the list view control is gone from the data panel, as well as the section for ASP.NET AJAX is not there anymore because I'm targeting 2.0. So that's just one capability in Orcas that makes it really powerful to transition to the new tool set really easily and seamlessly without having to worry about migrating all your applications over to a new framework. The next thing I want to do is kind of take a look at some of the CSS tools we have. So we're going to go ahead and open up an existing website I have to demonstrate that. I have an application here called MIX07. I'm going to open that up. And the first thing I want to show is some work we've done around master pages. So if people are familiar with the master page concept in ASP.NET today, you can basically define a kind of a scaffolding or look for your site, and then every page in your site can inherit that master. And we can just go ahead and take a look at that. So I have a very simple example here. I have a master page, and all it has is a heading, and it's got a content area. Now, one of the things that you could do in the framework that was really powerful was that you could actually nest masters. So you could actually have several layers of master pages, and that helped you kind of define different layers of content that you wanted to inherit from those master pages. So let's go ahead and take a look at this nested master. And you'll notice that this actually uses the master page called main.master. And it basically adds its own content, and then it also has an area for some other page that's going to inherit from it to define custom content. So if we go to design view, you'll notice that the designer actually grays out the portions that are contributed by the main.master, so we can't really edit those. But anything that's kind of available in this part, in this master page to be edited is editable in the designer. So that's all stuff you can do today. And then I can go ahead and define a content placeholder for anything that's inheriting from this nested master to define its own content. Well, one of the main limitations of Visual Studio 2005 was that if I did this kind of model, and then I actually went to a page, and I inherited a master page that actually had this kind of nesting where it was using another master page, when I went over to design view, you pretty much got nothing. And what we're doing now is we're actually understanding that nesting, and we're giving you the full WYSIWYG kind of display across both the nesting of the master pages. So you'll see both the content for the main.master and the nested.master is grayed out, and I can go ahead and edit all the content that's contributed by this particular page. So this is one of those pain points that I think a lot of customers who use master pages today in Visual Studio today ran into. And one of the things we've definitely done is we've listened to the feedback we've gotten from customers and tried to address those main pain points inside of the Visual Studio Orcas product. So I just wanted to show that because that's one of the new things in the design surface that we have that's really cool. But now kind of moving on and taking a look at kind of the CSS features we have, let's go ahead and open this page called default.aspx. And we'll switch over to design view. And you can see this is a pretty simple page here. It's just a set of list items, and it's got an image and some text for each list item. So let's go ahead and take a look at this design surface. One of the nice things we've done is we've made selection a lot more powerful. So you can see I'm selecting the image tag here. As I hit the escape key, you can see that it navigates up the chain. So that's a real quick way to kind of go to a particular context and then navigate up. And you can also see that our kind of tag selector at the bottom tracks that selection as I'm navigating up. So if you're working a lot with elements and you kind of want to hunt around and select something quickly, that lets you do that. Well, that's kind of cool, but another really cool feature that we have now is split view. So if you're working in source and you're working in design and you kind of want to make edits to the source and really quickly see what's happening, the split view feature gives you really powerful capability of editing source and getting a really quick preview of all the changes you're making. And the nice thing is, as I'm doing this and I'm kind of changing my selection, you can see that both the views are tracking. And that's in design view. If I go to source view and I kind of click around on different things, you can see that it also tracks. So we're really tracking across both views as you're moving around your document and making edits. So that's another really, really powerful kind of selection and navigation mechanism that we've added with this new design surface in Visual Studio Orcas. Okay, so that's really cool. Let's go back to design view and let's do some CSS. So, you know, really what we're defining here is structure. What you want your code to look like is very clean, where you're defining the structure and the content that goes in your page, but you really don't want any styling information inside of your page. You really just want to define the data and structure, and you want all the styling to be external. So let's say I wanted to change this page to have more of a kind of grid-like or tabular view. Well, there's several ways of doing that. You know, kind of the old or kind of unclean way to do it would be to add a table and a bunch of TRs and TDs. And people have done that, and it's kind of a pain, and it's really not very readable when you look at the markup inside of your page. But what you really don't want to do is change any of the structure and just design some CSS around it to get that same kind of layout. So we've got some great new CSS tools. The first thing I'm going to show is, let's just go ahead and style this list element and see how we can get it to actually get the kind of rendering we want. So we've got a new window here called CSS Properties. What the CSS Properties window does is it actually lets me inspect what kind of properties are being applied to the current element that I'm selecting, and then it also lets me set the properties on the current element by kind of looking at all the CSS that's available. One nice thing we have is a summary view, so I can actually just drop it down, and I can see exactly what's being applied to this list element. You can see that there's some things here that are coming from a particular selector, and as I click on those, you can see that the body selector gets highlighted. So I'm inheriting the font, the line height, and a couple of other things for this list item from the body selector. So if you're ever wondering where your CSS is coming from, this little pane here really helps you in doing that. Now let's say we want to go ahead and create a new style. So we have a couple of more windows here. We can go ahead and bring up the Manage Style windows. And the Manage Style windows kind of shows me all the styles that are defined in my existing document. You can see that I've basically linked in two documents here. There's a pager.css document that's linked in, and as well there's a stylesheet.css document that's linked in. As I click on these selectors, you can actually see a preview of the style that selector is creating at the bottom here. So you actually get a representation of what's going to happen when that selector is applied. I can go ahead and also create a new style. So let's just go ahead and create a new style that we're going to use to apply to this particular list element. So we're just going to call that photo list. And we're actually going to just select the LI element inside of the photo list class. we'll go ahead and create that. And you can see what it does is it actually creates a style element inside of my page. A lot of times I actually don't want that. I actually want the style to actually go inside of a CSS file. One nice thing I can do is I can just grab the style, drag it up to the stylesheet.css. It actually refactors the CSS code outside of my ASPX page and into the CSS file. So that's a really powerful concept. If you've defined a lot of styles in your page, quick and dirty, but then you want to move them out, you can just grab those styles and pop them into an external style sheet, and Visual Studio will do all the refactoring for you. So once we've done that, another nice feature we have, and this is one of the reasons a lot of people hand code CSS, is that the design surface most of the time doesn't write out the CSS that you want. You're actually going to write out an inline style, or it's going to create a new class. Something's going to happen where it's generating CSS that you don't want it to generate. Well, one of the things we've done here is we've given you full control over how the design surface generates CSS. So as I go and select this list item, we have this thing over here, a toolbar called Style Application. The Style Application toolbar tells me exactly where my CSS changes are going to go. As I'm editing this list item, I see that all the target rules are going into the photo list LI. Let's say I don't want that. I can go ahead and say, just put all the styles in line or generate me a new class. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and modify the class that we just created when we're styling this element. The style application has a manual mode and an auto mode. I think most people who are kind of really wanting control over how their CSS gets generated will leave it in manual mode and then kind of know exactly where their CSS is going as they're making edits to the CSS properties for a particular element. So we'll go ahead and leave it in manual mode. Let's go back and switch over to the CSS property grid. So now that we've actually got this style going over to the photo list class, we can go ahead and define things like, let's just say we want to change the font and we'll make it Arial instead of the font that was being inherited by the body. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to get this list to look a little bit like a tabular form and not like a list. So we can just go ahead and take a look at the layout category, and let's just change the display from being a list to being inline. So I just want to show everything in line. Now that I'm showing everything in line, you can see kind of the BRs are making my content not really display the way I want. What I really want is I want each line item to kind of nestle up against each other. So I can do that by just floating all of them to the left. So now you can see that really quickly I was able to kind of adjust the CSS properties, not change the structure of my document at all, but generate some styles to give me the layout and kind of look and feel that I want. Very clean code, generates the code exactly the way you want. So let's go ahead and go back to summary view. One thing you'll notice, another nice thing about summary view, is that I went ahead and defined that font family in two different places. And a lot of times, if you're working with a complex page that has a lot of selectors and a lot of styles coming in, you'll look at something, you'll be like, where is this thing getting applied from? Because my element, I have no idea why it's doing this, right? Well, now that we're looking at this list item, and you're wondering why are we showing Helvetica, because that's not what I wanted, you can really quickly understand that it's being overridden. And as I hover over that, it actually is saying that the original font that's getting applied was being overridden by the photo list class. And once again, as I select these different things, you can see at the top, it's actually selecting the selector that's actually contributing that style. So let's just go ahead and fix that problem. We'll go ahead and delete the font family. And you can see that now I'm getting the font treatment that I want. So these couple of panes that I showed really, really make it very powerful in terms of being able to program CSS using our design surface. The next thing I want to do is show some of the capabilities we have around CSS layout. So we've done some nice things in the designer. For instance, let's say I want a little bit of margin and padding around these elements because they're really, the images are really close together, and I kind of want them spaced apart a little bit. You'll notice that we've actually got little grab handles here around elements where I can go ahead and set a margin for it. So we'll just go ahead, maybe make it 10 pixels that way. We'll put it 10 pixels there. And we'll also do 10 pixels on the side as well. And you can see that now I actually have precise control. This mouse is a little finicky. Precise control over how kind of the margins are working. And not only that, as I'm selecting different elements, you can see that there's visual cues. You can see the hatch marks. There's actually visual cues in the design surface that shows you the margins that are being applied to each element that you have selected. So you can see that there's a sort of a shaded area around these elements that's showing me the margins. And you can see that, now that I did that, it actually went to the class that was shown in the target selection. So it basically, any edits that I'm making to those elements, if I look at my style application toolbar, I know exactly where those edits are getting persisted in terms of CSS. So let's just kind of go take a look at this page, how it runs. And it's kind of doing exactly what I wanted. Instead of showing me a list, it's showing me kind of this resizable thing, where as I kind of resize the browser, everything kind of scales appropriately and gives me the tabular format I want. Now let's go take a look at what source we generated. We go back to the design surface. This is exactly the page I started out with. I didn't change any of the structure. I didn't change any of the data. Generated very clean code. I actually generated no code. And if I go into the styles folder and look at the style sheet, and we'll go ahead and restart that. We're still in beta. Let's bring up my site again. Let's go ahead and look at that style sheet. You'll notice that the only thing we've done so far is created a photo list class to get the treatment we wanted. So we're generating very, very clean, very kind of concise code that gives you exactly what you want in terms of CSS and not modifying the structure or kind of the data that's inside of your HTML or your markup. So that's a quick look at kind of what we're doing with CSS. But typically, you don't really want to do you don't want to kind of just do static data like that. You actually want to bring in data from a database and then kind of incorporate the styles on top of that and kind of get the data to be dynamic in terms of being loading out of a database. So the next thing I want to show is some of the new features that we have around doing data inside of Visual Studio. So what we'll notice here is that we've got an app data folder. And inside of the app data folder, I have a photos.mdf file. And that's basically a SQL Server Express database that has some simple content in it. We'll go ahead and go to the Server Explorer and take a look at that photos folder. So we can see that it has a few tables in here. The first thing is there's an albums table, and it's pretty simple. It's just got an album ID and a name. As well, there's a photos table. So if I look in the photos table, you can basically see there's a list of photos, and each of the photos has an associated album ID. So there's a relationship between the photos and the albums in terms of these two tables. Well, one of the things that we have in Orcas is a new OR designer so that we can actually map these database tables over to objects that then you can program against. So let's go ahead and take a look at that designer. So to do that, all I have to do is select this new item type in our project called link to SQL file. When I go ahead and select that link to SQL file, let's give my class a name here. So I'm going to call it photo album. And it's going to ask me to go ahead and save that in the app code folder, so I'll say yes. And we'll see that here we've basically got a design surface where we can go ahead and drag out tables from a database and then map out the relationships between them. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the albums table, and we'll drag that out. And the next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and drag out the photos table as well. You'll notice that as I drag those out, the OR designer actually recognizes that there's a relationship between these two tables. So as I hover over the relationship here, it shows me that if I do albums.photos or album.photos in this class, that I'll actually get a photo element back. And similarly, from a photo, I can do photo.album and navigate back to the album. So as I'm programming against this, I'll have these really nice, strongly typed objects where I can navigate between the relationship as I'm working with the objects in my code. So let's just go ahead and save that out and see what code it generates. What it's generating as we save it out is you can see that there's basically a designer.cs class. If we go ahead and open that designer.cs class, we can see that it's generating a few classes here and using links. So the first thing it's generated here is a photo album data context. And this is basically the class that it uses to populate the data into the objects from the database that's defined when we drag the elements out on the design surface. The other thing it has is an albums class and a photos class. So if you inspect the albums class, you can see that there's some elements on here called album. There's an album ID. And then as well, at the bottom, there's an element here for photos. So for each album, you can actually use that object and navigate down to the photos that are associated with that album. Similarly, you can see that there's we can see that there's a class for photos. So what it's generating here is the same kind of thing, where we see the fields that are defined for photos, as well as the ability to jump back up to an album if you're on a particular photo table. So now that we've got this kind of object defined and it's being populated from the database, the next thing I want to do is I want to incorporate this object into my web application. To do that, what I can do is use some of the new controls that we have on ASP.NET. So we're just going to start with something very simple first. So let's just go back to the default.aspx page that we were looking at. And you can see right now we basically had kind of the static list here. And what we want to do is we want to replace this list with a dynamically generated list that comes out of a database. So I'm just going to start off very simple. Let's just go ahead and delete this. And the thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and bring up the toolbox. And we'll just start off with a grid view, something that everyone's familiar with. We'll drag the grid view out here. And the next thing I want to do is when this page loads, I actually want to kind of load those objects and populate them with data, the ones that I just defined in the OR designer, and then actually data bind the grid to one of the objects that are defined in my application. So we'll go ahead and on the onload method, we'll just do something very simple here. So we'll just do a new photo album data context, and we'll call that DB. And that's basically going to represent, DB is going to represent the objects with the data loaded into them. And then what I can do is I can go ahead and use link. So using link, I can do things like var result, and I can go ahead and say from A in DB dot, let's say, albums, select A. So I can use kind of query syntax to really get the fields and kind of the data that I want out of those objects, and then use that to bind it to the grid. So I can do a lot more powerful things here using link, and I'll be showing some of those in a second. Next thing I want to do is I'll go ahead and take that grid view. We'll set its data source to the object that we just created called result. And the next thing I want to do is we'll go ahead and just data bind the grid view. So now that we've got that, we'll go ahead and run this page and see what it does. And what you'll see is it's a pretty simple example of where I'm pulling all the fields out of the albums object, and then I'm actually binding them to grid. One of the things, though, is that the grid is kind of a black box. It really doesn't give you the representation that you want. And if we look at the source for it, what you'll notice is it's doing exactly the thing I said you don't want to do, right? It's creating a table-based layout. It's doing TRs and TDs. And this is the kind of stuff that when people are doing ASP.NET today, they're like, I really want control over what gets sent down to the client. I want clean code in my application, and I don't want the grid kind of generating the code that it does, which is kind of circa 1990s. So let's just go ahead and take a look at one of the new controls we. So actually, before we do that, let's just go ahead and take a look at some of the things we can do with links. So let's say instead of selecting all the fields in the albums object, I actually want to get some additional information from the linked photos that are for each particular album. So I can do nice things like some query syntax here where I can actually define the fields to pull out. So I can say, I'm interested in the name field, and we'll kind of get the name out of the albums object. But then let's say I want to define a field called count, and I can actually navigate down the hierarchy. So this is kind of what I was talking about, where the OR designer understands the relationships between the objects. So instead of the albums table, I can actually jump down to the photos table, and I can do things like, show me the count of the photos table, and then populate that field with the count from the photos table. So now that I've done that, what we can see here is that if we go ahead and run this again, because I have that kind of powerful query syntax inside of my code, not only am I just able to bind to the albums table, I'm actually able to hierarchically drill down into related objects and get things like the count of the number of photos that are associated with a particular album. And a lot of times in web scenarios, you're doing this kind of hierarchical data binding. And Link makes it really easy to kind of navigate that hierarchy and data bind the elements that you want. So now getting back to the kind of the layout and improving the layout to kind of do what we want. So I think what we want to do is basically create a set of list elements so we get very clean markup in terms of just having a set of list elements that are data bound and sent down to the browser. So what we can do is we can go ahead and use the new control we have called list view. I'm going to go ahead and actually scroll down here. Go ahead and remove this grid. And instead of the grid, we'll actually add this new control that we have in ASP.NET 3.5 called list view. Now what the list view control does is it actually gives me precise control over the template and kind of the markup that's going to get sent down when this particular control data binds. It has a couple of sections, so it has a layout template, so we'll define that first. We'll go ahead and create a layout template, and this is kind of going to be the structure that I want. And we'll basically say I want an unordered list. We'll give it an ID. We'll call it item container. And the next thing I want is I'll go ahead and say run at equals server because we might want to program it. And so you can see kind of in the layout template, I'm just doing an unordered list, and kind of the list view is smart about wrapping the layout template around the item template. Then I can go ahead and define an item template, which kind of defines the repeating section for the content that I want to data bind. I'll go ahead and define an item template here. And all we want to do in the item template is we basically just want to define a list item. And inside of the list item, we just want to pull out a couple of fields from the link objects that we defined earlier, from the albums table and also from the photos table. So I can do something really simple like just doing an eval here. So we'll dangle back at pound, and we'll basically just say eval. And let's just say we just want to pull out the same thing, so we want to pull out the name. And then we just want to follow it by the count. So we'll basically just pull out the same data that we were pulling out earlier, but now we're just using eval statements inside of an item template to kind of bind those into the template. So now that I've done that, I'll go ahead and run the page again. Good thing I have IntelliSense. Oh, good. It's actually telling me that I'm binding to a grid view. I just need to go ahead and change that to a list view. We'll run it again. So what we can see now is that I'm actually getting the markup I want being generated from ASP.NET. I'm getting the same data binding experience where I can use link. I can bind those elements into my list view control. But now when I look at the source, you can see that it's generating exactly what I wanted to see. It's not generating that kind of table structure that I was getting earlier from the grid view. So kind of the primary difference is that the list view control gives you full control over the markup that's going to get sent down to the client, whereas the grid view, as I mentioned earlier, is more like a black box where you can set properties on it, but you don't have that fine-grained control over what kind of markup gets generated. There's a question here. I'll take questions at the end, so we'll just hold that thought. Let's say we want to go ahead and take this and we actually want to do something a little bit more fancy. We actually want to show some of the hierarchical data inside of the list view. So we just don't want to show a list of photo albums. We actually want to show the photo albums, and then we want to nest the photos underneath each photo album. The nice thing about the list view is I can actually nest it. So I can go ahead and kind of take the list view that I have here. We'll just cut out the whole thing, and we'll copy it. And inside my item template, I'm going to nest a second list view. So what I can do here is, let's go ahead and format that. What I can see here is that I basically have the same stuff being data bound, and that was kind of the albums and the count that we were seeing earlier. But now I actually am able to nest the list view, and what I want to do here is I actually want to navigate those objects and pull out the photos and bind those photos to the kind of the nested data bound list view. So I want to do a couple of things before I do that. I'm going to go ahead and define an additional field that I want my objects to get populated with, because now I'm not only kind of doing a name and a count, I'm also kind of wanting to pull out a photos object or photos field. So we'll go ahead and define another field called photos, and using link we can go ahead and say I want to get the a.photos object back when I reference that. And now that I've defined that, what I'll do is in my nested list view, we'll go ahead and set its data source, and we'll just eval that photos object. So it's basically going to bind each album to the nested photos object that it has. So we'll go ahead and do an eval here, and we'll basically just say that as this nested list view gets generated for each record inside, for each album record, we're going to eval the photos object and then bind that photos object to this nested list view. The next thing I want to do is go ahead and change the format of how it's going to display. I don't want to display the name and count. I actually want to display stuff off of the photos object. So I can go ahead and change this to basically show that we're doing a image. And once again, for the source, we'll basically bind the image source to a field that's coming off the photos table. So we'll go ahead and grab the I think it's source. I think it's path, actually. We'll grab the path out of there. Oh, sorry. And then the next thing I want to do is we'll just go ahead and display the name of each photo. So we'll put a break between them. And I'll get rid of this, this count because I don't want to see that. So what we're doing here is, as the photos object's getting bound here, we're actually pulling off fields off the photos object. So we're actually showing the path and also the name, and we're data binding them to this nested list view. So let's go ahead and run that now and see what it does. So you can see what we're doing now is we're basically nesting two controls. We're utilizing the navigation that Link gives us, and we can get this nice kind of nested display where I can see each album, and then inside of each album I can get a photo display. And once again, if I look at the source, you can see that it's generating exactly the code that I defined. It's not generating anything additional in terms of the markup that's getting sent down by ASP.NET. So that's one great thing that we can do with kind of the list view control and Link. The other nice thing about the list view control is that it actually inherently ties into the other controls in ASP.NET. So we've got some really powerful concepts in ASP.NET like paging. We've got powerful concepts around being able to bind to different data sources. So we have different kinds of data sources that are available in ASP.NET. And the list view control supports all of those. So let's say I actually want to bind to a data source and then actually get paging across all these elements. I don't want to see, kind of an endless scrolling experience here. We can go ahead and utilize some new capabilities in ASP.NET to do that as well. So just to simplify the scenario, I'm going to get rid of the nesting. I'll just take out just the images, so we'll just work with the images themselves. So we'll kind of remove the outer list view. Just format this a little bit. So now we're basically just working with the list view control that's just binding to the photos table. I'll go ahead and remove this statement as well, and we'll just data bind it directly to the photos table like we were before. So we can go ahead and change our query. And I can make my query now something like from P in db.photos, select P. So we're basically just grabbing everything out of all the fields out of the photos object. And now that that's data bound, we can go ahead and take a look at it again. And we'll basically just see very similar to what we started with in terms of the static content that we were seeing, basically just a set of list items that have the photo and the name. Now, let's say I want to add paging to it. One nice thing I can do here is I can reuse that same class that I defined earlier. So I was able to kind of define the classes I wanted for how I want list items to be displayed. So what I can do is very simply just go to the list item here and say that I want to apply that same class. So I can just say class equals. Actually, we'll apply it to the unordered list because that's where I had it applied before. And we can just say class equals, and we'll just go ahead and pick out that photo list class that I created before. Now when I run the page, you can see that we're going to start getting the kind of look and feel that we want, but with data-bound elements. We're still getting very clean code. We just have a set of list items that are coming out of a database. And now I'm able to use the class that I created earlier with our CSS tools, apply it to these data-bound items, and get a very clean set of markup that still gives me kind of the nice tabular rendering that I want. But it's still not very good because, I still have to scroll down to get all the content to display. And what I really want is a paging experience because if I have a lot of data coming across, I don't want it to render all at once. I kind of want to page through it. So ASP.NET, with the list view control, basically has all the capabilities to do paging. And as well, they've got a new control called Data Pager so that we can go ahead and define how the paging UI works. We'll go ahead and drag the Data Pager control out here. And as we're looking at the Data Pager control, one thing I can do is go ahead and define kind of what control do I want this Data Pager to apply to. So I'm going to go ahead and pick the page control ID. And we'll just say we want the list view 1 control to get the paging behavior. We can also define kind of what kind of paging I want. So we'll just go ahead and add a fields section. And we'll say that I basically just want a numeric pager. So I'm just going to give very simple 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of the paging experience. You can fully templatize this pager. So if you, instead of using numbers, you want to kind of create your own template for how the paging looks, you can use a different paging field. So we'll just go ahead and use a numeric pager. And let's go ahead and run that now and see what we get. So we're still getting all the clean code that we want, but now ASP.NET's kind of providing us value on top in terms of kind of a paging experience that's built in. So we're now getting kind of the paging experience we want, but you can still see that it's not exactly the way I want it to look. And one thing I can do really easily is go ahead and apply a class to my data pager. So we'll take a look at this, and we'll just say class equals. And I created a pager class earlier, and we can kind of look at what that pager class does. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that to the data pager. And when we look at the pager class, it's very simple. It's basically the data pager control is just emitting anchor tags. It's just emitting 1, 2, 3, 4 anchor tags. And all I'm doing in the pager class is really just defining how an anchor should display. So I'm defining kind of a different color scheme. I'm defining kind of a border around it. I'm defining a margin around it as well. I'm kind of defining a hover behavior. So as I hover over anchors, I kind of get a little bit different behavior. When we go ahead and run this now, you can see that I'm kind of getting the kind of nice paging that I want here, where it's kind of giving me a nicer look, and I'm kind of getting a richer experience in terms of using CSS and then applying it over to the data pager class. What we'll do next is kind of take this and add the ability to actually bind it to a data source too. So if you're familiar with LINQ and you kind of want to do a lot of query syntax inside of your code before you do data binding, you can always write code like this, and you can kind of manipulate the data before the data binding happens. And a lot of times that's important when you have complex scenarios. If you're doing a fairly straightforward scenario, we've made it even simpler to bind to those objects that we've generated using the OR designer without having to write any code. So we can go ahead and just comment all this code out. And what we can do instead is we'll go ahead and add a new control here in ASP.NET called the link data source. What the link data source lets me do is any objects that I've defined in the OR designer in my application, or even in a class library project that's referenced in, I can then go ahead and data bind those directly to any of the controls that ASP.NET provides. Without having to write any of the code, it handles all the paging semantics and everything else. So I can go ahead and drag this link data source control down here. And what we'll do is we'll just set some properties on it. We'll say the context type name is the context for the photo album. So we'll just say photo album data context. And then we can also pull out kind of the table that we want to bind to. So we can say that for this particular element, we just want to bind to the photos table. And then all I need to do is go ahead in my list view control. I can just set a data source ID for it. And we'll just bind it to the link data source that we just created. And what this is letting me do now is, without having to write any code, I still have my objects defined where I can go ahead and manipulate them in kind of a data layer or a business layer, and then bind directly to them using the link data source control. And it kind of manages all the communication between the UI control and the objects that are in your business layer. So we can go ahead and run the page again. And one other thing I'll do is I'll just add a data pager to the bottom as well to kind of complete the scenario. So we'll add another data pager there. Actually, let me just grab the one from above since it's already configured. And we'll pop that in. So let's go ahead and run that. And what you'll see now is that without having to write any code, yes. Thanks for catching that, guys. Without having to write any code, I can also use the link data source. So I kind of have the options. I can kind of manipulate the queries and the objects using link syntax inside of my code, or I can kind of use a simple scenario and just use a link data source and bind to my objects directly. But we're kind of getting the same experience in terms of getting the nice paging and kind of the nice CSS that we can do from the design surface and applying it to our page. Well, that's kind of cool. It's kind of nice. But let's just kind of take a look at the experience we're getting here. One of the things that you'll notice is it's kind of jarring as I'm paging through here. Every time I page, it kind of scrolls up back to the top of the page. And it's not really very kind of modern in terms of the experience that you want to enable in the web browser. ASP.NET just shipped recently ASP.NET AJAX 1.0. All the capabilities that are in ASP.NET AJAX 1.0 are being included in ASP.NET 3.5 and in the Orcas release. And what we've done in Visual Studio Orcas is really made sure that we're incorporating all those capabilities and giving you access to being able to program all the functionality that ASP.NET AJAX provides. So one of the things that's really easy and really powerful to do in ASP.NET AJAX is, especially if you have a lot of investment in existing kind of ASP.NET applications, is there's a set of powerful controls that let you get very rich and kind of interactive experience without having to do a lot of JavaScript or client-side programming. The control that kind of is probably most famous for that is the update panel. So what I can do here is very simply, I'll just go ahead and add a couple of controls. So one thing I'm going to add is we'll go ahead and look at the AJAX extension part of the toolbox. When you're using ASP.NET AJAX, you kind of have to put a script manager control on your page, so I'll just drag that out. And that kind of manages all the client-side interaction and behavior that ASP.NET AJAX provides. Once I've added out the script manager, we'll just go ahead and drag in an update panel as well. And what the update panel lets me do is it lets me define parts of my page that I want to update independently of the rest of the page. So you can imagine if this data grid that I was showing is actually wrapped inside of a larger page with a lot of content or maybe like a lot of design. As I'm paging, I don't want the whole page to refresh and scroll up and down. I just want that particular table to reload with the new content as I'm paging through the data. So with the update panel, I can kind of get that behavior really quick and dirty without having to write any code at all, and I really don't even have to know AJAX. I just have to know ASP.NET. So I can go ahead in the update panel. We'll just go ahead and create a content template. That's kind of what we want the update panel to encapsulate. And we'll just create some space here. And all I want to do is I want to take all the content that I want to kind of refresh independently of the page. And we'll just put that inside of the update panel. So we're just going to grab out basically the 2 pagers and the list view. And we'll just pop them inside of the content template. So inside of the content template, we've basically just added the parts that we want to refresh independently. Now when I go ahead and run my page, what you can see is I'm going to kind of get the experience I want, because every time I'm paging, all it's doing is updating the portion that's encapsulated inside of my update panel. Really, really powerful concept. If you don't know AJAX today, or you just have a lot of investment in ASP.NET, but you want kind of independently refreshable portions of your content, you can go ahead and give this really smooth experience just using the update panel. So Visual Studio kind of provides that capability to you by incorporating all the ASP.NET AJAX controls inside of the toolbox and giving you really ready access to them. So that's great if you're doing kind of ASP.NET and want to kind of dabble in AJAX or take advantage of some of the new stuff. But a lot of people on the cutting edge, they live and breathe in the browser. They're doing tons of JavaScript. They're kind of down to the metal and kind of pushing the envelope in terms of what the browser can do. And one of the things that's been sorely lacking in our existing tools in Visual Studio today is our support for JavaScript. Really, there's very few tools out there right now that have great JavaScript support. And we've made a huge investment in Visual Studio Orcas to kind of give you the rich tooling that you expect of any language with JavaScript, making it and kind of bringing it up to par with other languages like VB and C#. So let's kind of take a look at what we're doing around enabling tools for people that are doing a lot of stuff in the browser, a lot of programming in the browser, and kind of the capabilities that we're adding for JavaScript. So I have another page here to demonstrate that, and we'll kind of start off simple again, kind of build up and take a look at the different capabilities that we're adding in. So we'll just start off very simple, and I'm going to go ahead and bring up a page I have here. And all it has is basically an anchor that's bound to a function. And below the anchor, there's a div that's ID'd, so I can actually program that div. So what I want to do is, as I click the anchor, I actually want to program the div to do something. So we'll just start off very simple. We'll just go ahead and create a function here. And we'll basically, one thing you'll notice is right away, we're giving you IntelliSense in JavaScript, and we're giving you keywords, things that weren't in the list before, like functions. So we're actually kind of populating the list and immediately popping it up as you start typing your JavaScript. So you can see that we got the function keyword here. We'll basically call the function load data because that's the one we want to program. And we'll go ahead and write some JavaScript. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and basically as I click this, I want to set my div to show some content. So we'll go ahead and create a variable, and we'll call it div1. And you'll notice that now I'm getting really rich IntelliSense, and I'm actually seeing new icons. The icons actually distinguish between the types that are available in the DOM. So before you kind of just saw a flat list and no distinguishing icons, you can actually see what's a method, what's a function, what's a property. So I can go ahead and go into document, and I can say get element by ID. It's kind of the standard stuff that everyone does. And I'm just going to go ahead and pull that div out from get element by ID. Now the nice thing is when I do that, Visual Studio is smart enough to know what div1 is. So I can then go ahead and say div1 dot, and you can see that I'm getting IntelliSense that's contextual, that's actually showing me that div1's an element, and I can set different properties on it. So I can go ahead and go to inner HTML, and let's just go ahead and just say something like hello mix. So we'll just go ahead and run that real quick. And we can see in our example here, we've got very simple stuff. But just programming those 2 lines of code, we saw a lot of new features in terms of showing IntelliSense that you didn't have before when you're doing JavaScript. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the other things you can do. So one of the things that people do a lot is program JavaScript in external files. You're not going to have a ton of JavaScript in your HTML or your ASPX page. So you're probably wondering, well, what if I'm writing stuff in another document? How is this going to help me? Well, let's just say we go ahead and reference another document here. So we'll reference a document that I created earlier. And out of my scripts folder, I'm just going to go ahead and pick up this document called large library.js. It's actually not very large, but we'll just grab it out. And now that I've done that, Visual Studio is smart about seeing that, OK, well, you've actually linked in a JavaScript file. I'm going to give you access to the members defined in the JavaScript file. So if we go look at the large library.js, you can see that there's kind of one function here. It's called get data over network. It takes a parameter, and it just kind of drums up some content and returns a string. If I go back to my page here, we'll go ahead and create another variable. And you can see now in my IntelliSense, I'm actually getting IntelliSense from external JavaScript files too. So all the functions that I've defined that are linked in, they're showing up in my IntelliSense. So you can see that I can get that function that I had there called get data over network showing up. You'll also see that I'm getting some basic IntelliSense about the parameters it takes. So it recognized that there was a parameter called path. It's showing me that, and that's kind of an optional parameter, so I'm not going to go ahead and define it. And then I can go ahead and set my I can set the data to go back to my inner HTML. Well, it kind of gets better though. Let's say as if I'm programming, I'm actually changing what my object is. So I'm actually changing it from a div element to an integer. Well, if I kind of go div1 dot, you can see that we're smart about knowing the assignments that are happening to your object. So we're not giving you IntelliSense for a div element anymore. We're giving you IntelliSense for what you'd expect for a number. And, well, that's kind of cool. Let's say I go back up here. You can see that we're smart about knowing exactly where you're typing. And as far as I know, I don't know of any other kind of dynamic IntelliSense that gives you kind of this type inference where it understands exactly kind of what type it is that your particular element is cast to at that point. So we'll just go ahead and remove that. And we'll run it again. And we can see now is what it's going to do is it's kind of just going to load the data that it was constructing into my div there. Well, that's kind of nice. What about kind of getting more information here? So, in my IntelliSense, I'm not getting I'm not getting a ton of information in terms of what the types are of this particular function. I'm just getting a very simple thing that's telling me it's got one parameter called path. Well, we can do a couple of more things, and we're basically have a syntax where you can kind of document your functions, and then the IntelliSense, just like in VB and C#, will kind of give you that documentation and show it to you. So inside of my function here, I can just go ahead and create a comment called a summary. And I'll just say, something like, doesn't really get data over the network. And we'll close that out. And when we save that, we go back over to my document here. You'll see that we're now starting to get a little bit more information in the IntelliSense. All of the types that are in the ASP.NET AJAX library are going to be commented this way. So you're going to get really, really rich IntelliSense in terms of seeing what each function does, getting a summary, getting a description, getting all the parameter information, and also getting a return type information. So the next thing I can do is we'll go ahead and add some more information here. And we'll basically say we have a param, and we'll give it a name, and the name is path. And we'll also give it a type. And then we can kind of say something like optional parameter for the description. And now that I've done that, I can go ahead and save that, go back here, and you'll notice we're now starting to get even more information. You can see that I'm getting a description of the type, and it's showing me that it's a string. So I'm not just seeing that it's a path parameter, I'm seeing the type of the parameter to pass. And once again, if you document all your libraries in JavaScript, this is going to be really, really useful in terms of being able to use those libraries in IntelliSense. And like I mentioned, ASP.NET AJAX is going to be fully commented this way. I can also go ahead and define a return type. So we'll just say returns, and we'll say type equals. Let's just do something kind of unique. Let's just say it's a date. Even though it's returning a string, I kind of want to highlight the benefit of doing it this way. So I can actually explicitly tell the IntelliSense, this is the type I want you to assign to an object when it calls this function. So I'm saying, in this particular case, this function is going to return a date. When you're showing IntelliSense for it, anything that you assign it to, give it IntelliSense for a date. So now that I've done that, I'll go ahead and save that, go back here. You can see that it's showing that it's a date type. And when I call it, when I hit dot, you can see that we're actually getting IntelliSense for a date type. So you can actually explicitly define in your functions what the return type is so that the IntelliSense shows that return type when you assign things to it. And similarly, when I go down here, you should be able to see that it's a date as well. So we kind of remember that across the assignment. So that's really cool. The next thing I want to show is kind of some of the other things you can do. So in a lot of pages, you'll actually have references to several JS files. But there's really no concept in the browser to reference JS files from other JS files. Even though you can call functions between JS files when they're both referenced in by the page, you can't really explicitly define that a particular JS file is referenced to another JS file. But let's say I want to kind of have a utility class that's linked into every single page, and I want to be able to access that utility class from my external JavaScript files as well. So I'm going to go ahead and create a utility class here. We'll add a new item. And we'll just go ahead and say it's a JavaScript file. Let's call it util.js. And I'm just going to do something very simple. Let's say function foo, param1. Let's do something like return. So we'll just kind of do a very simple function here just to show the concept. So now that I've kind of linked in this, let's say this JS file is linked to every single page, but I actually, in my external JavaScript files, also want to utilize the utility file. So at runtime, when it runs in the browser, I can go ahead and call that function foo from this file. But there's really no way for me to define a design time how that utility file should work. So we've kind of created a commenting mechanism here where we can add a reference to external files and then give you the IntelliSense for those external files within your JS files. So we can go ahead and kind of use the reference semantic, and then we can basically say something like path equals And we'll just do util.js. And what we can see now is that when we go down here, that we're getting IntelliSense across JavaScript files. So also a very, very useful concept, because a lot of times you're writing code in external JavaScript files, but you might have several external JavaScript files. And if you want to see the members in those, you can kind of do this syntax to get that IntelliSense. Well, that's kind of cool. The next thing I can show is not only do you reference external files, you can also reference the AJAX script library. So I can go ahead and add another reference. And in this case, I'm just going to say name equals Microsoft.AJAX.js. And this is basically going to link in the script library that Microsoft.AJAX provides. So not only can you link in external JavaScript files, you can also link in all the types that Microsoft.AJAX provides. So if you're using a script manager on a page, you know all the Microsoft.AJAX library is going to be available. You can go ahead and link it into your JS files. And now I can see things like kind of the dollar syntax that Microsoft.AJAX has. As well, Microsoft.AJAX gives me a really nice kind of typed model. So I have namespaces. Inside of the namespaces, I kind of see things like .NET. And I can see different classes. And I can also see things that I can do there. So I can get kind of all the rich framework and kind of typing that Microsoft.AJAX has in my IntelliSense by referencing it in my JavaScript libraries. Well, we can do that. We can also, if we go back to our default.aspx page, if we go ahead and add a script manager control here, we're also smart in ASPX pages to know that as soon as you reference the script manager, your IntelliSense should now start showing Microsoft.AJAX concepts as well. So if I go back up to my JavaScript here, you can see that. I'm just going to see if it needs to click in a second. Sometimes it's a little finicky. Just reload it. So you can see that we're getting the same syntax that you were getting in the external file, but in line with the page. And as well, I'm getting kind of the same types that are available in the Microsoft.AJAX library. I can also go ahead and kind of use the recommended way of referencing files. So instead of referencing the file here, which is kind of standard if you're not using Microsoft.AJAX, but if you're using Microsoft.AJAX, the recommended method is to actually reference the file within your script manager. I can go ahead in my script manager. I can define some scripts. And I can kind of add a script reference, and I can basically give it a path. And we'll just go ahead and use the ASP.NET syntax and say get it out of the util scripts folder and util.js. Go ahead and close that out. And so when I save that now, you can notice that I don't have a script reference here anymore. But if I look at my IntelliSense, takes a second to sync up. Oh, sorry. I know what I'm doing wrong. Large library.js. And we can see that it's kind of recognized that reference as well. And if you're using ASP.NET AJAX, it's recommended that you load your scripts through the script manager so that it has control over kind of when to initialize the page so all the right binding happens. So we can go ahead and do the exact same thing, call it get data over network. So let's just go ahead and run that again, and we kind of see that using the script manager, we're pretty much getting the same behavior. It's kind of loading it here. So the last thing I want to show is we've seen great IntelliSense. Well, what about debugging? Because a lot of times, debugging is one of the most painful things in terms of figuring out what's going on in the browser and kind of what's happening. Debugging, we had a fairly capable debugging functionality in Visual Studio 2005 for JavaScript. The unfortunate part of it was that it wasn't very discoverable. You couldn't really set a breakpoint in your JavaScript code. You had to kind of run your page, then go hunt for the special window that very few people know about, and then kind of load that window open, and then kind of load that document, and then set a breakpoint, then hit refresh in your page, and then kind of hit it. One of the things we've done to make it a lot more discoverable is kind of just said, OK, you set a breakpoint, and we'll hit the breakpoint inside of your page. So I can just go into my JavaScript here. I can set a breakpoint in a particular area. And I'll just go ahead and hit F5. It's going to ask me if I want to kind of enable debugging in web config. I'll go ahead and do that. And the next thing I'm going to show is, what it shows is an error dialog. And the reason we put this in is this is also one of the kind of key things that people don't know how to do when it comes to debugging JavaScript. We recognize that IE is not set up for debugging, and we kind of warn you about that here and let you know, hey, there's a setting in IE that needs to be set before you can actually debug it. In future releases of IE, we're going to automate this so it automatically sets it. But with current versions of IE, we just detect it and let you know that, hey, here's someplace you need to go to actually enable debugging so that it works with Visual Studio. So I'll just go ahead and say no there. I'll go to IE and actually enable debugging and show you guys how you do that. We can go to the Internet options in advanced. And there's basically 2 script options here. And the top option basically says disable script debugging, and it's checked. And what you want to do is you want to uncheck that. And now IE is actually configured for debugging. So if I go ahead and run this page again, you'll see that I'm not getting that warning anymore because we recognize that IE is set up properly. And we can see that when I hit load data, it's going to hit the breakpoint. Now this is really cool. You might be wondering, how did that happen? Because the file that's going to the browser isn't the file that I set the breakpoint in. So what we do is we actually map the breakpoints from the file that you set them in the file that gets loaded into the browser. And then what you'll notice here also is to make it more discoverable, right in the Solution Explorer, we actually show you the script documents that are loaded in the browser. So you can actually go ahead and open any of those and set them in the breakpoint. This was kind of the special window that you had to find. Well, we just put it in the Solution Explorer, so it's right there, so you don't have to find this window anymore. I can talk to you afterwards. It's a menu command that it's really hidden. And you'll notice that the page actually that I'm debugging right now is the page that's in the browser. It's not the page that I set the breakpoint in. But we map all the breakpoints over so that any breakpoints you set, it's just as easy as debugging VB or C# code. Just set a breakpoint, hit F5, and then you'll go ahead and hit the breakpoint. You'll also notice that we show all the other scripts that are loaded in the browser, so you can open any of those, set breakpoints in them, debug them. The other nice thing is you can see like data is kind of undefined right now. If I go ahead and F10, let's kind of go to the next line, you'll see that data now has data loaded, so I can get all the nice debugger features that I'm used to. We also get kind of all the nice visualizers, so if you want to see what that looks like actually, you can go to the HTML visualizer and see what that element and the string that's attached to that element looks like. So that's kind of nice. The other thing is if I go ahead and jump over to the locals window, you can see that we're also giving you more information in the debug windows in terms of the types of the elements. You're getting a little bit more information, and they're grouped and organized in a way that you would expect. If you debug today, everything's listed as an object, and it's just like one big flat list. And we're kind of giving you a lot more information about what the types are inside the browser and kind of showing those to you in the debugger, so you can see that as well. So we'll go ahead and continue, and we can see that the page runs. So with that, we'll kind of jump back to the slides. So to kind of conclude, we saw some great features with multi-targeting. If you want to jump over to the Visual Studio IDE, take advantage of all the great CSS tools, the JavaScript tools, you can do so and still program against your .NET 2.0 applications. Obviously, amazing tools for CSS, generates clean markup, gives you full control over how the CSS gets generated. Great tools for doing CSS layout as well. The design surface is shared with Expression Web, so you kind of get a great workflow if you're using both products against a particular page or a particular application. Some really cool stuff with the OR designer and link and the list view control, where you can generate data in a hierarchical fashion and really quickly, and then kind of get full control over the markup that gets generated by ASP.NET when you're doing data binding. And finally, for AJAX, we have some really cool stuff in ASP.NET AJAX with the update panel in terms of taking advantage of AJAX-like capabilities in existing ASP.NET apps. But for people who are doing cutting-edge stuff in JavaScript, we also have an amazing new tool set for IntelliSense and debugging of JavaScript. So thanks for attending the talk. And I'll be here for questions. We'll take a few questions. We have about 10 minutes.